You got a lot of books on American history. You read them all?
Yeah, that's why they're here.
If you want to read a real history book, read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. That book will knock you on your ass.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, actually, Dr. Mary Grabar debunked Howard Zinn, so...
Oh. Well, what about Anna Nicole Smith's The 69 Project?
You mean Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project?
Yeah, that's what I said, the 1619 Project.
Well, actually, they both sucked. But Dr. Mary Grabar actually debunked the 1619 Project as well. So, suck it.
Okay.
Actually, we're going to have Dr. Mary Grabar on the show.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And rest assured, she's wicked smart. And you're wicked dumb. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hey, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Sons of History podcast. I am Dustin Bass.
And I'm Alan Joaquin.
And we are going to have a delightful conversation with our guest this week. But before we do, this week in history.
All right, so I'll start with the This Week in History. Now, I can't give you a precise date because nobody knows for sure.
Oh,
but
God!
Yeah, but if you go back 2,500 years ago this week, and it should be September the 26th, which is this coming Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Some people say the 27th, but we're going to do with the 26th for right now.
There we go.
If you ever saw the movie 300, Rise of an Empire, which was the sequel to the movie 300, you'll remember the great naval battle that took place between the Greeks and the Persians. Well, that was known as the Battle of Salamis. That took place 2,500 years ago this week, if you're using the proper calendar and state that there was no year zero. Now, what was the Battle of Salamis? Okay, if you remember the movie 300, King Leonidas led his 300 Spartans, and there were, although they didn't really show it in the movie, there were actually 7,000 Greeks altogether, and they were there to stop the Persians, King Xerxes. After a 3-day battle, they were defeated. The Persians went through, they destroyed Athens, Plataea, Thespia, and then as they kept going to conquer the rest of Greece, there was Themistocles, who was in the movie 300, Rise of an Empire, and the Spartan Eurybidius, I think that was his name. Eurybidius, there we go.
Yeah.
Now, Eurybidius and Themistocles led a naval engagement against the Persians and defeated them at the Battle of Salamis.
I always thought it was Eurybiades.
Eurybiades. I don't know. I can't, it's like I read the book and I'm like going, there's no phonetics in these books.
That's tough.
But Eurybiades was a Spartan and Themistocles was a Athenian. And now, Queen Artemisia, the evergreen, the really hot.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. She was Vesper Lynn in James.
Yeah.
Okay. She was a real person, and she actually led a ship in that battle. And King Xerxes sat and watched the battle. So you're talking about, now depending on who the historian is, there were about 600 to 800 Persian ships versus about 368 to 378 Greek ships. And they fought in the narrow straits of the Salamis because they knew that with the bigger numbers, they couldn't openly engage them in the open seas. They had to do it kind of in the narrow areas. So the Greeks had heavier ships, and they were able to. They lost 40 ships in the process. The Persians lost about 200 to 300, depending on who the historian is. It was a huge defeat. It was the high water mark for the Persians in the invasion of Greece in 480 and 479 BC.
Well, there you go.
So, yeah, it happened this week, 2,500 years ago.
Beautiful. Well, my choice happens on September 22nd, 1776. There was a guy by the name of George Washington who needed spies to go behind enemy lines out in New York, and one of those spy volunteers was a man by the name of Nathan Hale. One day after a massive fire that broke out in New York City, he was arrested and sort of charged as a spy. The next day, they hung him up, and he died. Now, Apparently, not before saying that I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country. So, pretty interesting. September 22nd, 1776. And in 1985, the Connecticut legislature officially designated Nathan Hale as the state hero. Pretty cool.
Yeah, very cool.
So that was This Week in History. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are about to have our next guest. This is the second episode of the new season. Second episode, second season. Alan, are you excited about this next guest?
I've been excited ever since you told me she was coming back on our show. I remember the first time we talked about Debunking Howard Zinn. I was reading this book, and I hadn't even finished the book, and I was like, we need to get her on the show.
Absolutely. Yeah, and she graced us with a conversation last year, and she is back with us to talk about her new book, Debunking the 1619 Project, Exposing the Plan to Divide America. Are you ready, Doctor?
I am ready. You want to show audience the book? You were holding it. I think you know what it looks like.
Well, it's going to show a screen. It's going to show a graphic, Had you watched, the most recent episode, you'll know that there's a graphic up there. But, I'm always prepared. I'm always ready. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Let's get started.
All right, let's do it.
All right, just to do you a favor. All right, everybody, we've got Dr. Mary Grabar on the line. Dr. Mary Grabar, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
We're
doing pretty good.
Fantastic.
Yes.
We are doing so much better now that you have arrived, and it is going to be so great talking to you. We had you on the show. I think it was last year when we discussed your book, Debunking Howard Zinn, and that was a really fun conversation.
It was.
I remember that conversation because I was here, you were at your place, she was at her place.
Yeah.
But somehow we all came together.
I was at home, I think. I don't know if I was sick or I was on call, but this time, when he told me that we're going to have you back on the show, I made sure I'm not on call. I'm going to be here. So that's why we can have a much better conversation. And I have been looking forward to this for quite some time.
So we are obviously going to be discussing your new book. Came out September 7th of this year. So it is just now out, Debunking the 1619 Project, Exposing the Plan to Divide America. I got to ask you, thus far, we're only a couple of weeks into your book being released. How has the reception been to your book?
Well, it depends on if they're, people who are my enemies are just ignoring it. And I found the same thing happened with the Howard Zinn book until I was a panelist at the White House Conference on American History a year and a day ago, sadly, when, Donald Trump was still president. I still remember that day fondly. And then all the leftists came out of the woodwork and accused me of, attacking the poor Howard Zinn, who'd been dead for 10 years and so forth, which is irrelevant. But I was on Fox and Friends this morning, and there seems to be a demand for the book because the Amazon sales improved quite a bit. So that got a lot of traction. People are buying it. I think they hear about it, and I think they're wanting to have a resource that they can go to because they know that the 1619 Project, which is being slipped into their schools, is just absolutely toxic propaganda for their kids.
Well, I was going to say that anybody who's listening and watching, these two books are required reading. The 1619 Project and Debunking Howard Zinn. Now, this is how I discovered you, Dr. Grabar. I read this book. I saw that it was recommended. I read it, and before I was even finished, I remember telling Dustin here, we need to interview this lady. Yeah. So these two books, I am telling you, this needs to be required reading for everybody. So there's a lot of homeschooling going on right now. Parents, buy these two books.
Amen.
So, okay, now let's begin. Now, the 1619 Project. wanted to ask, what are some of the deliberate lies, the half-truths, and I'm sure there's got to be some truths, maybe, kind of, I'm not sure, but could you tell us what some of the lies, the half-truths, and some of the stuff that is factual in the 1619 project that you address in your book?
Yeah, well, I think we can start with the big one, which is that slavery here was unlike anything that had ever existed in the world before. And that's the title of one of my chapters, because of its slavery has existed as long as we know, as far back in time as we can go historically. Slavery has been around. It's been an institution. It's older than the oldest profession probably, and it was practiced worldwide. It's been justified by the major religions. I don't think there's anything in the Bible against it, nor in other religious texts. It's been accepted as part of the normal course of human existence for most of time. It's relatively recently in history, in world history, that the idea of enslavement has been seen as a crime and something that should be abolished. So that right there is false. And if you are a student and you read the 1619 Project and you have no other knowledge about history, you would think that slavery was something that was invented by the colonists and deliberately instituted here, deliberately practiced in order to gain wealth, and that it wasn't being done anywhere else in the world. One of the truths is that, yes, people did profit from it. But the half-truth, or what's left out, is that there were also Black slave owners. That's not mentioned, and it's not mentioned that the other Africans are the ones who initially captured the slaves. They did the raids, they captured them, sold them to the African or Muslim middlemen, who then marched them off to the coast, put them in the barracoons, where many did not even survive. The conditions were so horrid. And that's when the Europeans came and purchased them. So this notion that the Europeans went into the hinterland and just kidnapped, which is the word that's being used in the 1619 Project, kidnapped these Africans, is historically wrong. It has only been tried a few times. That was by the Portuguese. And each time they did it, they just got slaughtered. And so they relied on the Africans to capture these slaves initially. Sometimes they did employ the services of warrior tribes like the Imbangala, who went into Angola and helped them, but by themselves, they just could not do that. So those are some of the big things. And I think the reason that those fallacies are promoted is because the author or the creator of this whole project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, wants to make this a Black versus white issue. So Blacks are the only ones who are enslaved, and the only enslavers are white people. And that's the setup that she gives. So those are, just a couple of the big ones. I can go into Thomas Jefferson and, what's said about him. And there are, many other parts of the 1619 Project that are just factually wrong.
So speaking of Thomas Jefferson, in your book, you mentioned that Thomas Jefferson is sort of seen as the linchpin for the 1619 Project. How is that? And why do you think the creators pinpointed him?
Yeah, well, Thomas Jefferson has changed in reputation generally, according to textbooks and historians that tend to be on the left. He was known as the Apostle of Liberty because he wrote the Declaration of Independence, or largely did. And he was a promoter of freedom of conscience and religion, and was seen as someone who, was a proponent of freedom. That has changed by virtue of the simple fact that he owned slaves. So it's a very simplistic equation. You cannot be an advocate of liberty if you own slaves. So he has been cast as the ultimate hypocrite because of his ownership of slaves. And of course, he is presented in the 1619 Project not only as a enslaver, but one of the worst, that he owned slave labor camps, evoking the images of Nazi concentration camps and the gulags of the Soviet Union. And he was like the other enslavers who often worked the slaves to death. He was only concerned about making money, and he had absolutely no concern about those who were enslaved by him, and that he saw them as subhuman. And it's like a whole long list of charges against him that don't hold up to historical fact. So a lot of these, a lot of the historians today like to talk about a person's lived experience, right? What was life? That's as valid as the statistics and the research you do in the dusty archives. But if you read, about Thomas Jefferson's life, he was born into a slaveholding family. His earliest memory from the age of 2 or 3 was of being carried on horseback on a pillow. I don't know how he did that. The slave, put this 2-year-old on horseback, to the new estate. So here you have this image of this toddler basically being carried by a slave on horseback. And you think about that image. That's not a subhuman. I don't know if you guys have kids, but you wouldn't entrust your child to a subhuman. So there's that stereotype. Jefferson, when he came of age, his father had died when he was 14. He was entrusted with the care of these people. It was a responsibility. In Virginia at the time, you could not just simply say, you are free, go out and find a job. There were strict manumission laws. For the longest time, the slaves had to be sent out of state. Anyone in good conscience would have to provide for them. And so there were all these obstacles, and Jefferson indeed did want to see the abolition of slavery. And the 1619 Project says that neither he nor any of the founders who owned slaves cared about abolishing slavery, which in fact is not true. So it's a gross distortion of who Thomas Jefferson was. And there's a lot of evidence of, about the things that he did and that he said, the actions he took in regards to abolition, or, gradual abolition. So when we say abolition, we tend to think of, Garrison, people who are out there, the utopians who, want to basically tear down the government, a real radical. That wasn't Thomas Jefferson. He was a statesman, and he could see that violence was brewing, and he could detect that a civil war was coming. And he knew also that if he took actions and they were the wrong actions, it could actually exacerbate the problem and make things worse for slaves and prolong the institution of slavery in terms of how long it lasted.
Well, now the next question I'm going to ask, there's a reason for it. I've had debates with atheists and agnostics about, the creation was, did we have intelligent design or was evolution? Um, you know, which one created Earth or the universe? And some of my agnostic and atheist friends were saying, well, evolution should be taught in a science class, not intelligent design, because that's not science. So this is where I'm going to lead into this next one. Uh, Ron Chernow, who wrote a really great book about Washington, was in a panel with is it
Nicole Hannah Jones.
Nicole Hannah Jones, and I was curious as to why Chernow didn't call her out, kind of like, if intelligent design is not science, why is this lady on this show when she's not a historian? So,
And what she wrote is not history.
and what she wrote is not history. So now you're
ahistorical. Yeah.
yeah. Now your book pushes back against the 1619 project. Now, why is it important for people like Chernow or historians, educators, politicians, and even the average citizen to push back? Have they?
Yeah, well, that's a very good point, and that's something I've noticed with historians on the left, and also with Howard Zinn. So they are critical, like Michael Kazin was, and lambasted A People's History of the United States in Dissent magazine. But as soon as Mitch Daniels it was learned that he had wanted to prohibit its use in public schools, then they jump to the defense of the leftist, even though they know that their scholarship is shoddy or it's just completely false, and I think you're talking about, I think that was on MSNBC, and they were talking about the January 6th insurrection. And David Blight was on there, the biographer of Frederick Douglass. And that really surprised me, especially with Chernow doing that. And I don't know if they want to keep their leftist bona fides, or they really just hate conservatives so much that even when conservatives agree with them, that they will be antagonistic to conservatives and sort of justify the kinds of projects that Nicole Hannah Jones has. So one of and this also happened with Sean Wilentz and with Leslie Harris. And so their justification is that slavery was central to our history, which I would disagree with. It wasn't central. And that the conservative criticism is a threat to keeping slavery and the oppression of Blacks as a focal point. But what I would say to that is that there's an incredible amount of historical research and writing that has been done on slavery. The president of the Alexander Hamilton Institute, where I am here, resident fellow, Robert Paquette, is one of the best known historians on slavery. He was a student of Jean Genovese. So, you know, he calls himself a conservative. So there is a tension on slavery, but I think it's just an excuse, and it really is shameful, in my opinion, that someone would stoop that low, and maybe in order just to get a spot on television, or to oppose conservatives. I think it says something about their character, and it also sullies their reputations as historians. So if you're willing to bend and to pull back from your criticism in order to have a platform with this person and be, sort of radical, I think that says something about your credibility and your integrity.
Well, okay, now in your book, well, okay, let me go back a little bit. I'm sure you've seen the movie Schindler's List.
I actually haven't.
You have not seen that? Okay, well, there was a transformation.
Neither have I. Don't
What do you
worry
mean
about it.
you've
I
seen it?
haven't.
You haven't seen?
I was making out the whole time.
Oh, funny.
Yeah, you like that?
Newman.
No,
Well-
I honestly, I haven't seen it.
You haven't seen it? It's a
Yeah.
good movie.
I know it is.
But Oscar Schindler there was a kind of his a transformation, a moment where he opened up his eyes and realized something's wrong. This whole thing is wrong, and he was a member of the Nazi Party who ended up helping the Jews. So, the founding fathers had a transformation. And because as they were talking and discussing freedom and liberty, and I know that many of them were like having an aha moment. How can we defend freedom and at the same time own slavery? So, which leads to the next question: is that what I know that based on including the Declaration of Independence, that the institution of slavery, there were steps taken to end it, and there was some pushback from the South, but we are hearing from the advocates of the 1619 Project that the revolution, the American Revolution, was fought to protect the institution of slavery from Britain, which I know is false. But what does the book state? Where do you prove, or what is it that how do you address this in terms of the false claims that the American Revolution was to defend slavery?
Yeah. Well, the way she does that is to speak in generalities and to say that the British were having second thoughts about slavery, and she's not specific. And actually, it was Sean Wilentz in his Atlantic Magazine article, who disputed that, as did other historians. The abolitionist movement was starting here in the 1760s and 1770s, and the movement to abolish the international slave trade in London did not begin until 1787. So in terms of chronology, she's just wrong. And I think one of the things she does is she uses a lot of sophistry. So she'll use terms like, some, and that was sort of the adjustment that was made by the New York Times later to say, some of the colonists wanted to protect slavery. And of course, if you can find two colonists, that's technically correct then, right? But the fighting had started, and a year before, there's no justification in terms of specifics in the 1619 Project that to back up the claim that the colonists were worried because Britain was on its way to outlawing slavery. So it's all very vague, and it doesn't comport with the history.
Well, and another thing I was going to state is Thomas Sowell. I love reading Thomas Sowell, and he's written a lot about slavery, and I was surprised when I first read some of his works where he said that India and China had more slaves than the entire the Americas, North and South America. So my next question is that, and we mentioned this earlier about America being portrayed as having a monopoly on slavery. Didn't America and Britain, weren't they the ones that helped lead the way to end slavery? At least in the
Well,
West.
yes, of course. Yeah, so it was the Quakers who were first prompted by, I think, these Germans in Pennsylvania, and the Quakers were slave owners, and so you already start having that in the early 18th century, this movement to end slavery, and it emerges from the Western tradition. So even within the institution of slavery, you have the church fathers who are like St. Basil saying, that there is a code of morality or ethics for slave owners. So within this institution, they say you should try to keep the family units together. You need to treat these people humanely. You can't just do anything with them. You can't just, work them to death, as Nicole Hannah-Jones claims. So there was a code of ethic within that institution. And so that progresses and leads to, looking at this and saying, well, why have slaves at all? So it's a gradual evolution, and it comes, from the Western Judeo-Christian tradition. In the rest of the world, people are like wondering, what do you mean I can't have slaves? So, there was, in my Zinn book, I get a quotation from Bernard Lewis, who relates a story of the Sultan of Morocco, who's asked by some British diplomat or something in 1842, so what are you going to do about slavery? And he's like, what are you talking about? why, what's wrong with it, right? And you have slavery in Africa. You still have it to this day, even though it's been formally outlawed in Mauritania. You have sub-Saharan Africans who are enslaved by the Muslims, by the lighter-skinned Muslims. And I go into some of the practices of slavery in Africa. Slaves were often used as sacrifice during the funerals for people of wealth, sometimes buried alive. And so you in terms of, when you look at those practices and the lack of a code of ethics, and then with, declaring independence and being forced that way, as you said, to look at these people who are not independent, we are, the Western tradition is definitely advanced in terms of freedom and liberty, and it has been a beacon for the world.
Your book does such a good job of, that's the whole purpose, is to debunk the 1619 Project. And what I thoroughly enjoyed, among many things, about your book is that it wasn't a Mary Grabar commentary. It was, I'm pulling from all of these sources, contemporary sources, and numerous historians that have already done all this work, that in order to write something like the 1619 Project, it requires you to ignore all of those historians, and it also requires you to ignore a lot of what the contemporaries were doing, like the Founding Fathers, and all the work that they were doing before 1776 to end the slave trade, including Thomas Jefferson, and including George Washington. But I want to ask you this, and in my review that I did of your book, I pointed this out because I thought it was important. We noticed that you pulled from historians across the political aisle, left, right, and center. Why was that important to do?
Well, I want to be fair, and and I want to acknowledge the work that these historians do. So, if David Blight gets on MSNBC and starts spouting off about politics, and I think it's unfair, or if he goes into commentary in his book, the same with Sean Wilentz, well, I know that's commentary, but if their work is good, I have to acknowledge it, and I see it as valuable, and so I evaluate it, and look at their sources, look at how they are treating that particular situation. I think you can pretty much tell if someone is biased. So their work, their research is good. It's when they go off into the commentary that I don't go along with them. So I wish it would work the other way. I wish there was this sort of sense of collegiality among scholars where people could sit down as they used to at some point. That's what academic conferences were, where you sat down and you presented your research and you read and people questioned you and they said, you should consider this, or, oh no, on this point, you've gotten, I think you might be wrong or misled. And that's the way it should work. It shouldn't be, well, even if you're right, I'm going to say you're wrong because I don't agree with your politics. So I think politics should be kept out of it, out of scholarship as much as possible. I know I call myself a conservative. That's what I am politically, but I also consider myself a conservative in the sense that I want to conserve what is best in our civilization, in the West, in Western civilization. And that is this reliance on reason and debate and collegiality and respect and for what happened in the past. So, when I look at the past, I want to put myself in that person's shoes. So my PhD is in English, and I tend to think in literary terms. And so when I was reading about Thomas Jefferson, I was thinking, wow, this is really very interesting. What was his life like? And you get that sense if you read Dumas Malone. But I also was curious about the slave that's carrying 2-year-old Thomas Jefferson across the fields, right? What's his life like? His life has meaning. He's not just a pure victim, whose life, has no meaning. All these people's lives had meaning, and you have to respect that. And one of the things that happens in the 1619 Project, I've been thinking about this, is, Thomas Jefferson is demonized. There are demons and there are saints. All the demons are white, the saints are black. But the saints are just victims. And you don't get a sense that these are real people. They're not just, complete victims who are constantly whipped. I mean, they had some agency. They had aspirations. They loved, they were fully human. And I think the big crime of the 1619 Project is that it dehumanizes everyone. And if you go back to Nicole Hannah-Jones and think about what she said during the 2020 riots, right? And she said she was proud of the fact that that the 1619 Project inspired rioting. Well, there were between 25 and 30 people who were killed. Some of those people happened to be Black. The St. Louis retired police chief, I think his name is David Dorn or something like that. Well, his life has meaning, right? And it's the same thing with history. So I think this kind of ideological axe grinding just really dehumanizes everyone. I don't know if I got off the subject there, but I kind of went off on a tangent.
No, I think that was. I think you answered that fine. I mean, you're pulling meaning from all the historians, and I think it was, to me, it was like a breath of fresh air to see, because there were a number of historians that I noted in there. I'm like, okay, I know this one, leans left. I know this one was center. I know this one was right. And it was great to see that, because you can always guarantee that there's going to be pushback and be like, oh, this is a strictly conservative. It's just like, no, this is a compilation of a massive amount of history. And that was just the great thing about this book. Now, I have one more question left, unless something has come up upon you.
No, I am enjoying this discussion. I would love to just sit and have a beer with you, do like a beer summit, and just talk about this for hours.
We do need to have a beer summit with all the historians that we've had conversations with. That would be absolutely stellar. But I do have one last question. You dedicate your book to Eugene Genovese. Why him? Who is he?
Well, Eugene Genovese is someone that I knew in the last 5 years of his life when I was teaching at Emory. He died in 2012. And as I mentioned before, he taught Robert Paquette, who is the president of this institute. And he also taught Douglas Ambrose, who is one of the other founders. So there were 3 founders of this institute, the Alexander Hamilton Institute, who were teaching at Hamilton College, and two of those were Gene's students. Gene was, I don't know, I just really, if you met Gene, you would love him. He was just a great guy. He was funny. He had this dry sense of humor. I think he had a moral compass. He could see through things. And of course, you may know that he was at one time a member of the Communist Party, right? And I guess he was kicked out, or he left because he said he zigged when they should have zagged. He wasn't following orders, and he had a conversion. He returned to Catholicism at the urging of his wife, Elizabeth Fox Genovese. And so I admire him for that. I used to tease him. One time we would have lunches about a few times a year, and once I brought this book from his radical days when he was leading a teach-in or something. But I also, what I admire about his kind of scholarship is that he, even during his Marxist years, he was true to the evidence. So in 1969, you may recall, there was this meeting of the American Historical Association where I think it was Howard Zinn and some other historians who wanted to put out a statement against the Vietnam War. And they felt that as historians, they had a moral duty to speak out. And Gene, even though he was a Marxist then, was a dedicated historian. He was principled, and he said no, because once you start becoming an activist as a historian, you start changing the evidence. You start manipulating and you start lying. And that's exactly what has happened since the 1960s. And we see it manifested, especially in Howard Zinn, who really wanted to do that. So I admire him for having done that. And when you read his works, he acknowledges the complexity of the institution of slavery, and he seems to have tried to understand all the people that are involved. He can, as I have a line in Debunking the 1619 Project, where he says, for all the horrible things that the slave masters did to their slaves, you have to acknowledge that they warned us about totalitarianism. So there is good and bad in all people. And he, as an honest historian, recognized that and understood also that, to not acknowledge the agency that the slaves had, with their limitations. There was bargaining, there were rewards, there were masters who, were horrible. There were others that used, a combination of rewards and punishments. So it's all very complicated. And so he was honest to the material and worked with it rather than manipulating it and using it for his own purposes in this kind of egotistical way as a crusader. So, there were just many things to admire. The last thing was, here I am in this building. It's a mansion that was built in 1832. So we became independent, and Gene left his books on slavery, and they're downstairs. And so when I was writing this book, there's like a whole shelf of Thomas Jefferson books and all 6 volumes of Dumas Malone's biography of Thomas Jefferson. And he just seemed, his spirit seemed to be here when I was writing this book and going through his pages, and he had, respectfully notated them in light pencil.
Nice. Yeah, I needed respectfully notated in light pencil in my books because I jab in ink. Well said and well deserved for that dedication. And Dr. Grabar, thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. And I'm so glad that Alan came across your book, and now we've had you on the show twice. Yeah. So it's just been great.
Yeah, I tell people, everyone who will listen, you need to read these books. You just because I can't tell you how many times I've had discussions just about Christopher Columbus alone. And, I've used your information, and people were like, what? What do you mean? I'm like, yeah, look it up. And I've had people, like, as you mentioned about how Howard Zinn used the ellipses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they would quote me word for word, and they would put the ellipses on there saying, okay, this is what Columbus said. And I'm like, no, he didn't. And then I would,
he sort of did.
Yeah, I would whip out like his journals and said, this is what he said. I said, this was, so thank you, because I can't tell you how many times you've saved my neck.
Yeah, because it's so important. It is so important because Alan and I, we already know, and I think, probably a vast majority of people already know that to an extent, these books are not going to be read by one political aspect of of the country, but from the right, or at least conservatives and moderates who will read these books, to an extent, your books will get over to the left via conversation. And I think that's incredibly important. So thank you again for all that you're doing, Dr. Grabar, and thank you again for being on the Sons of History podcast.
Okay, well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Well, Dr. Kevorkian, that was a great interview. It was worth the wait. I'm glad you got her back on the show.
I am too. And Dr. Kevorkian is the name that I use for you.
Well,
I would prefer Dr. Doolittle. Actually, you should be Dr. Doolittle because you're such a massive fan of the Doolittle raid.
well, that I did get to become friends with one of the last living Doolittle Raider and his daughter. So,
Yeah.
yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I will tell you this, ladies and gentlemen, regarding the 1619 Project book, the Debunking 1619 Project, I honestly can't advise you enough to read this book. Not only because it's going to give you a rundown of debunking the 1619 Project, but it will introduce you to a number of historians that you should be reading, especially if you're wanting to know the history of slavery. And so it is a very powerful book. And that was one of the things that struck me, is that there was so many sourced writing in there. It was like so many quotes in there. It wasn't, Dr. Mary Grabar, this is how I feel and this is how I see it. And like, no. She went straight at the accusations and debunked them via historical fact. Mm-hmm. And that was it. So
and now these books of hers are a manual, because we all have to take up, I guess the term is take up the mantle, and defend our country, defend Western civilization, because the United States is a great country. Do we, have we done things wrong? Has this country done things wrong? Of course, and and
we've done a lot right.
have talked about them, but when you compare,
but you don't destroy progress in the name of progress.
Right. I mean, you don't. Okay, granted, yes, there is the sinner, but you look at what they have accomplished. What they have created, what they've left for us—a great country, freedom. Everybody is fallible. I mean, I think the last person that was without sin lived about 2,000 years ago. So
and lived only about 33 and a half years before they killed him.
Yeah. So the state killed him. So
hello.
So you can't just sit there and look at the person who was the sinner and say, okay, forget about the things that they built for us that we cherish to this day.
Exactly.
So we all have to stand up and defend our country. And Dr. Mary Grabar gives us each the manual to put up the fight,
do just
the armor
that.
and the sword. Yeah.
And speaking of books, book and movie recommendation. This is my book recommendation. If you want to get a quick view on how I personally feel about it via the Sons of History, you can go check out the book review that I put up that was published on the Epic Times. I did a book review. That was our first book review. So yeah, check it out. It was released. This book was released September 7th, and it is for sale. Go get it. Get some for your friends and your family members as well. Learn it, know it, replicate. All right, my movie recommendation. So we were just in Fredericksburg. So I had my stein with me, my beer stein. It says Fredericksburg on there. And people of Fredericksburg were awesome. Everybody was great there. And while I was in the hotel room, what movie was on? The Hunt for Red October. Love that movie. If you've never watched that movie, it is one of the best Cold War movies that you're going to come across. Sean Connery, Alec Baldwin, Scott Glenn, James Earl Jones, and a list of other great actors.
Fred Thompson was in that.
Fred Thompson is in there, yeah. And I always love it when he's in movies. He's so, just chill. Is the camera even rolling?
Yeah.
And you could tell that that's just how he is in real life. Great movie, and actually it was based off of Tom Clancy's debut novel. So pretty great stuff. That's my book and movie recommendation.
I watched Friends while I was in Fredericksburg, but because I was with friends.
Wow. That was
Trying to save it somehow.
Yeah, you can't.
All right. Okay, now my book and movie. Let's start with the
Mm-hmm.
book, Debunking Howard Zinn. Now, I let him do that one. I'm doing this one.
Oh, you let me. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Listen, I can't say enough about this book. I get into debates all the time with people. And, like, I'll give you an example. Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus is I think it's the first chapter. And I can't tell you how many times I've had debates with people who cited Howard Zinn every time. And they would quote word for word from Howard Zinn.
Yeah.
Or who Howard Zinn plagiarized from, a Dutch communist by the name of Koenig. Howard Zinn is one of the reasons why we have so much anti-Americanism and anti-Western civilization in this country today.
Yeah.
If you want to combat it, you need to read Debunking Howard Zinn.
Right.
I can't say it enough. If you're homeschooling, it should be required reading.
Yeah.
So, now for the movie. Now, I mentioned this earlier. Again, it depends on which calendar you use, because I think the Greeks used the wrong calendar. But if you use the one where there's no year zero, 2,500 years ago this week was the Persian rampage through Greece. When they burned Athens, you had earlier in this month, you had the Battle of Thermopylae, which was seen in the movie 300.
Mm-hmm.
But the movie 300, Rise of an Empire, which came out later, it has Eva Green, who plays Queen Artemisia. I think that's her name. You had Lena Headey, who played the Queen of Sparta.
Don't ask me, man.
She was in the Game of Thrones.
Great.
Lena Headey.
Never watched her.
Not Headley. Headey. She's in there. A couple other people. The guy who played in the movie 300, the guy who played Ephialtes, the guy who played Xerxes, they're all in it. But it's a historical fiction in that they've got the right characters. Themistocles is in there. Artemisia is in there. They kind of fictionalize it a bit, but it's a real battle.
It's like a Howard Zinn version.
Something like that, yes. But it's not as good as 300. But for those of us who are history buffs, if you want to know about the Battle of Salamis, which took place this week, 2,500 years ago, watch it. That's the big naval engagement. That was a real naval engagement, and it was the high water mark for the Persian invasion of Greece in 480 and 479. So. Yeah, watch it. Again, it's not great, but you will like it nonetheless.
Well, our lights are going out, so let's turn out the lights on this show.
Alrighty.
Where can people find us?
Well, they can find us on our very own website, www.thesonsofhistory.com.
Lights are going out all over the place.
I know. All right, I'll make this quick. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Like us on Facebook, but subscribe to us on YouTube. And also like us or whatever, follow us on Instagram.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm telling you. Yeah, who's the lighting guy around here?
I don't know, but is it Jared? We're going to fire him.
Trash.
Where's the scab? Whatever happened to the scab?
Scab's dead.
Oh.
Actually, he likes everything that we do. He's
Okay.
a good guy.
Oh, good.
Keeping track. So, all right, ladies and gentlemen, that is it. We hope that you have a great week and go get these books.